Hello, and a huge welcome to this week's episode of Gina Gardner and Friends. I'm joined today by Margaret O'Connor, who's often referred to as David fighting Goliath. She is a woman who's focused on the truth. She's an author, and she's going to talk to me today, and we're going to discuss how we move forward with our lives. You know, lots of people get stuck and find it very difficult to find a way forward. But this is a lady on a mission, and I'm really thrilled, Margaret, to be able to welcome you to the show.
Oh, thank you very much, Gina. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So let's start off by give us just a potted history of you and how you come to be David against Goliath.
Yes, I happen to grow up in an Irish Catholic family, and our faith was very important to us. So, as a very young girl, I discovered that, there was a big difference between what girls can do and boys can do. And in fact, my mom bought my brother Paul as a birthday gift a cardboard replica of a church altar. And Paul was playing the part of the priest, and myself and my twin sister Pat, we grabbed two chairs and sat down in front of the altar. We were the parishioners, and everything was going fine until a certain point. And you have to remember, I was a young girl then. I spoke up and I said, "Paul, I want to be the priest." And I'll never forget. He said, "You can't be a priest. You have to be a man. Only men can be priests." So I learned at a very young age that there was a different, a disparity there between girls and boys. And then just a few weeks later, my mom was a church organist. And after her choir practice, she asked us if we would like to go down and stand on the altar. Well, we were really excited because, of course, girls were never up on the altar. So I remember my twin sister Pat, she stepped behind the altar, and then it was my turn. And Gina, I practically just got behind the altar and I was sort of centering myself and imagine looking out. This must be neat on the weekends because back in the 50s, those pews were packed with people.
Yes.
When all of a sudden I heard this gruff voice, "What are those girls doing up on the altar? They don't belong anywhere near that altar." And my mom wasn't one to rock the boat.
No.
She said back to the priest, he was the Monsignor, "Well, that's right, Father, unless they're there to clean the altar." And he just turned around and walked out. But I was really surprised because, again, she really didn't rock the boat. But obviously, what a way to treat young girls. His whole tone, his whole demeanor. So, what I'm trying to say is, I definitely learned at a very young age in those two examples that, wow, there's a difference, there's a disparity there. So I went on through my life in my 20s, and I would still hear talk of, yes, there were women priests within the Catholic Church's early history. So you get to a certain point in your life, and I went for further study. I went into a master's program in pastoral ministry. And I was very naive. I thought, oh, this place, seminary, has a very good research library. Maybe I can find something. But of course, there was nothing to be found. So then, as I went on more, my curiosity took over me. And I kept reading and reading. And finally, I came across several wonderful books. John Vingegaard, he was a former Catholic priest, the Ordination of Women in the Catholic Church. And then there was Gary Macy, a Protestant minister, The Hidden History of Women's Ordination. And then you have various Catholic sisters. One is Chris Schenck, Crispina and her sisters. a woman in authority position, and she recalls, or actually they have pictures of down in the catacombs, uh, and it shows not only males in religious positions, but as well women in religious positions. And you have people in that book, that women that are biblical experts, and they can actually depict these scenes. And it's very striking. Say on one wall in the catacomb, there was this very high straight back chair, and that denoted that that was the bishop's chair. All right, and the bishop's sitting there. Well, on the opposite side, so the left side of the wall, there's that same chair, but now you see a woman, and you definitely see her in priestly attire. So what I'm trying to say is, through, you won't hear of this in the Bible, but through biblical research, there definitely were not only women priests, there were women bishops, deacons, women apostles. And again, going back to my early roots, you were asking the question, why am I called David going against Goliath? Because when I personally found this information out, I was reading John Vingegaard's book, and this information was just so wonderfully special. And again, for anyone hearing this for the first time, it will be shocking, because we've always been told there never were women priests, period. John Vingegaard has a chapter on Mary, Mother of God, Jesus's mother. And Mary, Mother, was a woman priest. Well, I threw the book up in the air, but then, of course, I had to gather it up, and did I just see what I really saw? And I personally, it just hit me. I had all that excitement and that joy, and that just dissolved away with an awful realization. I've been betrayed by my church. And I mean, how do you ever begin to swallow it or digest it? And it was a period there that it was very hard for me. And I thought, I've got to move on. I just can't be stuck. So how am I going to do that? Well, I decided to follow Jesus's model. He himself, we know, he spoke up against the particular authority types that were in charge of, the church back then. He spoke up, and he not only spoke up against it. If he thought something was wrong, he tried to rectify the situation. So I am following in Jesus's example by openly speaking up, and as well, Mother Mary was a woman priest, and in a sense, I feel I'm following in her footsteps. But seriously, to me, it's like a grassroots effort, because there are just so many women, Catholics, even other faith denominations that, that have interest, that obviously you're always interested in another denomination, why is it maybe that they don't have women priests, and yet other ones do. But whether it's here in the United States, and then we forget about going worldwide, go over to Asia, go over to Africa, and whether it's in Ireland and whether it's in Australia, there's just millions and millions of women that have never heard this special information. And I don't care what faith denomination you belong to, that isn't right.
It's so interesting how, for me, there's a number of levels to this. One is that very often, and not just in terms of this particular situation with the Catholic Church, but history buries the truth. They talk about it's the victor who writes the history, who writes their truth. And over the annals of time, that truth becomes almost concreted in to be the only truth. But whether you're talking about religion or talking about politics, I think we all have to recognize that whoever is writing the history, the account, inevitably is going to be colored by their own agenda, whether that agenda is positive, negative or neutral. And I think, let's broaden it out. We've been talking, the theme is moving forward with your life. And ultimately, you've moved forward with your life and you've made a decision that you're going to search for the truth. You weren't going to take things at face value because that didn't feel right for you. And if you think about, women, even in my very limited understanding of the history, the time of Jesus, women, generally speaking, had a role that was very much around women looking after the children, taking care of the house, and so on, and men being those who would be the breadwinner and so on. They would be the people in authority. And yet one of the things that's always puzzled me is how very clearly there appeared to be that women would be kept separate to men, for example, in terms of being baptized. And I've always felt it sat a little strangely that men would go into the water with women and baptize them. And yet some of the information that I'd had is that women were brought in to baptize women, and it wouldn't be logical for them to have some sort of standing within those early Christian groups. I just wondered what your view was about that.
Well, that's interesting that you say about women were there for the baptism, because an argument is, anyway, within the Catholic Church, that women that actually did that baptism for other women were called deacons, and that just wasn't true. They were just there to help because of the privacy issue. And but there's just such a separation there, obviously, between what women can do and what men can do. And even going back to what you said about the scribes writing, people say, well, no, the church didn't lie. Over centuries, obviously, if something is dismissed, well, then it's there, but it's like way in the background. But people just don't realize that the actual role that women had. That's what I'm trying to bring forward. We hear of Mary Magdalene is like just one apostle. There were more apostles, and it was really interesting, Gina. There was a woman that did biblical research, and she came across the concept of what's apostleship? An apostle is anyone who's divinely sent out, not only by Jesus, but by a particular community. And then you look into the biblical research, and they start mentioning an apostle called Junia. And for centuries, she was looked upon as a male. But with the biblical research, no, that was a woman. So that's another apostle. And then there were the women around the tomb that they were apostles as well. But you see these like the threads that come into this, and they like authenticate that, yes, there was more than one apostle. And yet, why are we today still hearing just the story of Jesus alone sending out his 12 apostles?
I find it fascinating how history becomes shaped by the people who choose what gets broadcast and what doesn't. But actually, I want to leave that to one side, if I may.
Okay.
We live in a world where we're in the 21st century. I'd like to think that we've moved on, that, whatever went on in the past, and we're talking about a couple of centuries ago, based on the culture and the circumstances of a couple of thousand years ago, that we have moved on, and that recognizing that actually it's down to how we choose as a society or as a group within society to continue and to operate and to interact with one another, which is going to make the difference. And I can see that if you're talking about, the how we treat one another, the 10 commandments, and the teaching of treating people as you would like to treat your neighbor as yourself. What strikes me is that the Protestant church, and I can only talk about in the UK, a few years ago went through great trauma because they wanted women to be ordained. And some men left the Protestant church and actually moved to the Catholic church because they didn't want to be involved in an organization where women were ordained. And yet now, several years after the furore, many communities are served incredibly well by women priests or women vicars, women deacons, and so on. And that it seems to me that the way forward is to recognize that each individual brings with it their skills, their experience, their expertise, their heart. And maybe that's where we should judge things, because it's what contribution can we make? How can we be of service, which seems to be, and this is a very personal view, and I'm sure there are viewers out there who may disagree with me, but I feel that's what's important, is what value do we bring to any given situation, not what our gender is.
Oh, definitely. But that's the whole issue, is that gender issue is the major issue and still is within the Catholic Church. Because you probably heard there were 5 biblical reasons why women, explicitly couldn't become a priest. And one of them is that women were not made in the image of God. And yet all of these 5 biblical reasons have been proven through biblical research to be cultural prejudice, cultural bias.
Isn't that?
And yet,
I'm going to say that I don't know. I have to say I'd never heard that was one of the reasons why one couldn't be a female Catholic priest, because my view is that we are all made out as we are part of God, and God is part of us, whatever our gender.
Yes, and I mean, even going back to Genesis 1:27, that God created them, woman and man. God made them.
Yes.
And I mean, right there, we know we're equal. But again, this prejudice continues on. And even down to about the idea that women couldn't teach in church because women were so feeble-minded and emotionally unstable. And there was even a common law back then that said that this particular condition was more prevalent in women than in men. And we couldn't have women up on the in an institution or a church teaching. But there again, it's blatant.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've just had the funeral of the Queen, who served this country for over 70 years. Feeble-minded, that's not how I describe her. But on that note, Margaret, I know you've written a couple of books. Tell us the titles of your books and where people can get them.
Oh, sure, Gina. The first one is Scandal in the Shadow, scandal meaning omission, the original priest, Mother Mary. And that's at Amazon. And the second book is Journey of a Celiac Soul, SOUL, A Second Chance at Life. And that as well is at Amazon.
Now, are these fiction, non-fiction?
These are nonfiction.
Okay, now it's interesting because both of us are celiacs. I was diagnosed in 1987, and I know that you were very, very poorly before you were diagnosed as a celiac, and that you sort of reinvented yourself, having discovered that actually it wasn't all in your mind, and that all of these symptoms were not phantom but very real.
Yes, because I mean, there's nothing more offensive of going to doctors and being told, that it's in your mind, it's not real. And yet, the second chance at life refers to I was within 5 months. My doctor told me of being 6 feet under in the ground. So I'm very fortunate. My twin sister had brain cancer, and she didn't have a second chance. So when you have an experience like that, you literally look at life like through a whole new prism.
You know, for
And
those of you who are listening who don't know what celiac disease is, people talk about having a gluten intolerance. It's very different. So people who are celiacs have an immune problem. So when you ingest wheat, rye, oats, or barley, even in tiny, tiny amounts, your body thinks that it's a germ. And in trying to destroy the germ, it destroys the villi, which are is the inside lining of the duodenum, which is where you take in all the vitamins and minerals. And if you imagine finger-like processes, which are giving you an extra area for the body to absorb, instead of them being like fingers, they are actually flat. And so people who have celiac disease, they don't absorb vitamins and minerals, and they can have all sorts of other problems too. And it used to be very, very difficult to diagnose. The only way they could diagnose it was by taking a biopsy of the duodenum. These days, there is a blood test, which is about 95% accurate, which can tell whether you have celiac disease. And the only treatment for celiac disease is to be absolutely obsessional about not eating gluten in any form or other. Otherwise, it can make you very ill. And a piece of bread the size of your small fingernail can take around 6 months for your gut to recover.
And that's why that's so important, because people think, oh, come on, a little wheat's not going to hurt you, if you go out to a restaurant. And people don't realize, as you said, you can have those symptoms up to 6 months within your body after that initial one meal.
Yeah.
And when people call this a fad diet, you, in a sense, you can't blame them because it's been presented that way. But what's happening with celiac disease is you put it, it's so, it was excellent the way you described it, but it's actually your own body is starving.
Yes.
You have physical starvation, and that in no way is a fad diet. And the reason it's so important is if people see something as just, oh, it's poo-poo, that's not important, then you get a server at a restaurant and they have just heard that this is just a fad diet. I went to a nose ear doctor, and he said, "Is that celiac diet? Is that really helping you?" I mean, I was horrified. What I thought, I'm going to any other doctor.
I think you
The
probably
man
need
in
to see somebody else. Yeah.
this age, and I told him, and I don't know,
So
Gina.
your book about your journey with celiac disease is called, say the title again.
Journey of a Celiac Soul, a Second Chance at Life. And it looks not only at celiac disease from the physical component, but as well, it looks as a spiritual component. And in the Catholic Church, at one time, they just had just a pure wheaten host. Then they offered a low gluten host. But for a person such as myself and others, we are very sensitive, and the low gluten host is not acceptable for us. So the church has gone on its merry way, seemingly that this issue of the host has been taken care of explicitly with the low gluten host. And for years, I had an older Monsignor that was wonderful. He allowed me to put a pyx, that's a little metal container, up on the altar with a gluten-free food in it. So
Yeah.
then there was just no issue.
Examination then. Yeah.
And then moving ahead 20 years, a newer associate came in, and after 5 months of giving me communion, one day he told me, "We have to go outside and talk." And it was in the middle of winter. I said, "Well, can't we just talk here?" "No, we have to go outside." He said, "You know, I no longer can give you your communion host." So I obviously want to know what's up, what's going on, what is this change? And he just wouldn't tell me. So I called him back, and I kept pressing. This is my spiritual food, Father. I deserve every right to know why there's been such an abrupt change. And he says, "Oh, well, it was my conscience. I just no longer can be breaking canon law and give you communion." And I said, "Father, you understand that canon law, church law, wasn't even in existence when Jesus was alive. And what did Jesus do? He healed people, he fed people, and you're going to deny me of my spiritual bread, and yet you're going to go to sleep tonight with a good conscience." And I'm talking to him over the phone. "Oh, Peg, I'm so glad you understand."
Sadly, we're at the end of the show, and I think there's a lot in there. What I would say to you is, if you have celiac disease, I've written a book which is about the practicalities of living with celiac disease.
Oh,
What
that
you can and
sounds
can't
interesting.
eat,
Yeah.
what it is and how it works in the body, and a list of foods that are safe, and template letters that you can give to friends who are going to be catering for you, or hotels or restaurants, so that they understand the issue. And I was diagnosed in 1987. Things have moved on a long way since then. But if you're interested in that, it's How to Live Well and Eat Well with Celiac Disease. And that also is on Amazon. Margaret, it just remains for me to say a big thank you to you for sharing your story, and to say to you as listeners, well, before I do, I'd love to know your story and how you're getting on. Maybe your story is a suitable one for my show. Please do contact me at Gina Gardiner and Friends. So that's Gina, Gina, at Gina Gardiner, Gardiner, and friends.com. Thanks very much for joining me, Margaret, and thank you, the listeners. See you on
Thank you,
the next show.
Gina.